The summer sun beat down on Pine Grove Street as 9-year-old Emmy set up her lemonade stand with determination in her eyes. She had spent the entire morning carefully arranging her grandmother's mason jars and hanging the hand-painted sign that read, "Emmy's Fresh Lemonade, $1." Her mum watched proudly from the porch, remembering how she'd helped Emmy perfect the recipe over countless taste tests in their kitchen. The young girl had a bigger dream than just selling lemonade. She needed new school supplies, and instead of asking her parents for money, she decided to earn it herself. "I can do this," she had told her mom while mixing another batch of her special recipe, adding just a hint of mint leaves, her grandmother's secret ingredient. The neighborhood quickly took notice of the new business venture. Mrs. Johnson from next door was her first customer, praising the perfect balance of sweet and tart. "This is the best lemonade I've had in years, sweetheart," she exclaimed, already reaching for another glass. The mail carrier stopped by for a refreshing break from his route, and even the local gardener paused his work to enjoy a cold drink. Emmy's confidence grew with each satisfied customer. She carefully counted her money, practiced making change, and kept her workspace spotless, just like her dad had taught her about running a proper business. Her little table transformed into more than just a lemonade stand. It became a neighborhood gathering spot where people stopped to chat and enjoy the summer afternoon. The success of her first hour encouraged Emmy to add her own creative touch. She started garnishing the drinks with fresh mint leaves and colorful paper straws, turning each serving into a special experience. She even kept a jar of sugar-free lemonade ready for Mr. Wilson, who always mentioned his diabetes but didn't want to miss out on the fun. Children from nearby houses joined the growing crowd, some asking if they could help, others inspired to start their own stands. Emmy welcomed the company, showing them how to properly measure ingredients and serve customers with a smile. The secret, she told them with the wisdom of a seasoned business owner, is to make each person feel special. As the morning turned to early afternoon, Emmy had already served over 30 glasses of lemonade. Her money box held enough to buy the new backpack she'd been eyeing at the store, but she wasn't ready to close up shop. The joy of running her own business, meeting neighbors, and making people happy had become more rewarding than the money itself. Then everything changed. A police cruiser slowly turned onto Pine Grove Street, its presence casting an unexpected shadow over the cheerful scene. The officer inside watched the busy lemonade stand with an expression that made the temperature seem to drop despite the summer heat. None of the customers noticed at first, too busy enjoying their drinks and conversation, but Emmy felt a strange knot forming in her stomach as the car came to a stop. What happened next would turn a simple summer afternoon into something nobody in Pine Grove would ever forget. But at that moment, Emmy just stood behind her stand, gripping her grandmother's pitcher tightly, unaware that her little business was about to become the catalyst for change in their quiet town. Police Chief Thomas stepped out of his cruiser, adjusting his badge that gleamed in the afternoon sun. He'd driven past 3 other lemonade stands that week, all run by kids from the other side of town, without a second glance. But something about this one made him stop. His boots crunched on the gravel as he approached, each step heavy with authority. The cheerful chatter around Emmy's stand gradually died down. Parents instinctively moved closer to their children, and neighbors who had been enjoying their drinks now stood watching with concern. Mrs. Johnson, still holding her half-finished lemonade, stepped forward slightly, positioning herself near Emmy's table. "What do we have here?" Chief Thomas's voice cut through the summer air like ice. He picked up one of the mason jars, examining it with exaggerated scrutiny. "You got a permit for this operation." His tone carried none of the warmth typically used when addressing a child. Emmy's hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. "I'm just selling lemonade, sir. Would you like to try some? Everyone says it's really good." She reached for a fresh jar, trying to maintain her smile despite the growing tension. "Do you understand the regulations about food service in this town?" The chief set the jar down hard enough to make the others rattle. "Health codes, business licenses, tax registration, these aren't optional." Each word seemed carefully chosen to intimidate rather than inform. The crowd began to murmur. Mr. Wilson, who had been enjoying his sugar-free lemonade, spoke up. "Come on, Chief, she's just a little girl selling lemonade. We've had kids doing this for decades." Others nodded in agreement, phones appearing in hands, recording the increasingly tense situation. Chief Thomas turned to face the gathered neighbors, his hand resting deliberately on his belt. "Unless someone here wants to be charged with interfering with a police investigation, I suggest you all step back." The threat in his voice was clear, causing several people to retreat, though they didn't leave entirely. Emmy's mom hurried down from the porch, but before she could reach her daughter, the chief had already started dismantling the stand. He knocked over the pitcher, sending carefully prepared lemonade splashing across the sidewalk. The mint leaves scattered like confetti in a sad parade. "But that's my grandmother's pitcher," Emmy protested, tears welling in her eyes but refusing to fall. She stood her ground, smaller yet somehow stronger in the face of such unnecessary force. The chief's response was to pull out his handcuffs, the metal catching the sunlight in a cruel flash. "Maybe this will teach you about following proper procedures." His words carried a weight far heavier than any lesson about business permits. Mrs. Johnson gasped as he moved toward Emmy with the handcuffs, and several phones rose higher, their cameras capturing every moment of this abuse of power. No one knew yet that Amy's father was someone the chief should have thought twice about crossing. No one knew that this moment would spark changes bigger than their little town had seen in decades. All they knew was that they were watching something deeply wrong unfold on their quiet street, and not one of them would ever forget the sight of those handcuffs approaching a 9-year-old's wrists, all over a simple cup of lemonade. The cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around Amy's small wrists as neighbors watched in stunned silence. The sound seemed to echo through Pine Grove Street, drowning out even the summer birds. Emmy stood straight, tears rolling down her cheeks, but her head remained high, a picture of dignity that no 9-year-old should have to show. "This is completely unnecessary." Emmy's mom tried to step forward, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and fear. Chief Thomas held up his hand, stopping her in her tracks. "Ma'am, stay back or you'll be next." The threat hung heavy in the humid air, but phones kept recording, documenting every word, every action. Mrs. Johnson, who had known Emmy since she was a toddler, couldn't contain herself anymore. "I've lived in this town for 40 years, and I've never seen anything so shameful." Her voice cracked with emotion. Other neighbors joined in, their voices rising in protest, but keeping their distance after the chief's earlier threats. "She's just a child selling lemonade." Mr. Wilson called out, his usual quiet demeanor replaced by righteous anger. "What's next? Arresting Girl Scouts for selling cookies?" The absurdity of the situation would have been laughable if it weren't so terrifying. The chief roughly guided Emmy toward his patrol car, ignoring the growing chorus of protests. Her small feet stumbled on the sidewalk, but she caught herself, refusing to fall. The spilled lemonade soaked into her new shoes, shoes she had bought with her own babysitting money, but she didn't look down. "Everyone needs to disperse now," Chief Thomas barked, his hand resting meaningfully on his weapon, but nobody moved. Instead, more neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Phone cameras continued recording, capturing every moment of this abuse of power. Emmy's mom ran inside to make urgent phone calls, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold her phone. She knew exactly who to call, her husband, who had spent years fighting against exactly this kind of injustice. But for now, Annie was alone with the chief, and the crowd could only watch and document. "I know my rights," Emmy said quietly as the chief opened the car door. Her voice was small but clear, words she'd learned from dinner table conversations with her father. "And this isn't right." The chief's face darkened at her words, but the cameras were still rolling, catching his every reaction. The backseat of the police car was built for adults, not children. Emmy had to hop awkwardly to get in, her handcuffed hands making it even more difficult. The leather seat was hot from sitting in the sun, but she didn't flinch. She looked straight ahead, her grandmother's words echoing in her mind. Sometimes being brave means being scared, but doing the right thing anyway. Through the car window, Emmy could see her demolished lemonade stand. The carefully painted sign now lay in a puddle of spilled lemonade. Her grandmother's mason jars were scattered, though thankfully not broken. The mince leaves were wilting in the hot sun, much like how the town's trust in their police chief was wilting in the heat of his actions. As the chief slammed the car door, the crowd's murmuring grew louder. Mrs. Johnson was already on her phone, calling the local news station. Mr. Wilson had his tablet out, uploading the video to social media. The neighborhood kids stood in a tight group, some crying, others angry, all of them learning a harsh lesson about justice and injustice. What Chief Thomas didn't know, as he started the engine with an air of smug satisfaction, was that he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. He had no idea that Emmy's father was a renowned civil rights attorney known for taking down corrupt officials. He couldn't have known that this moment would be the beginning of his own downfall, captured on dozens of phones and about to go viral across the country. In a downtown office building, Amy's father sat in a meeting with the state attorney general, discussing police reform policies. His phone kept buzzing, but he'd silenced it for this important discussion. Finally, during a brief break, he checked his messages. His face changed instantly as he read the flood of texts and watched a short video clip of his daughter in handcuffs. "I need to go," he said, standing up so quickly his chair rolled backward. "My daughter?" The Attorney General, seeing the usually composed lawyer's hands shaking, leaned forward to look at the phone. His eyes widened at the video playing on the screen. "Take my car," the Attorney General offered, tossing his keys. "It's faster than waiting for a cab." He'd known Amy's father for years, respected his work in civil rights cases, and now watched as a personal and professional crisis collided. The drive to the police station felt endless. Every red light was an eternity. Amy's father gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, remembering all the cases he'd handled where children faced unfair treatment. But this time, it was his little girl. His mind raced with legal precedents and procedures, but his heart pounded with a father's worry. Social media was already exploding with the video. His phone kept chiming with messages from colleagues, journalists, and civil rights organizations. But he didn't need to look at any of them. He'd spent 20 years fighting against abuse of power, and now his own daughter was experiencing exactly what he'd been trying to prevent. Pulling into the police station parking lot, he noticed several news vans already setting up. Word traveled fast in small towns, especially when the story involved a respected civil rights attorney's daughter being arrested for selling lemonade. He straightened his tie, took a deep breath, and stepped out of the car. Inside the station, the atmosphere changed the moment he walked through the door. Officers who had been casually chatting suddenly found paperwork to focus on. The desk sergeant's face paled as he recognized the well-known attorney. Everyone in law enforcement knew his reputation for successfully prosecuting police misconduct cases. "Where is my daughter?" His voice was quiet but carried the weight of 2 decades of courtroom victories. The desk sergeant fumbled with his radio, calling to the back. Through the window to the holding area, he could see Chief Thomas's face change as someone whispered in his ear, finally telling him exactly who Amy's father was. The chief emerged from the back office, his earlier arrogance replaced by poorly concealed concern. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding," he began, but Amy's father cut him off with a raised hand. The gesture was small but powerful enough to silence everyone in the room. "The only misunderstanding," he said, his voice controlled but vibrating with intensity, "is your belief that you could abuse your power without consequences. Now release my daughter. We'll discuss the multiple violations of her civil rights with the review board." The security cameras captured the chief's face shifting from red to pale as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. This wasn't just about a lemonade stand anymore. This was about systemic abuse of power, caught on camera, witnessed by dozens, and now involving one of the state's most prominent civil rights attorneys. As Amy emerged from the holding area, still carrying herself with remarkable dignity, her father felt a mix of pride and pain. Pride in her strength, pain that she had to show it in this way. But as he knelt to unlock her handcuffs with the key they'd finally provided, he whispered, "You did nothing wrong, sweetheart." And sometimes it takes something like this to make real change happen. The video of Amy's arrest spread like wildfire across social media platforms. By sunset, millions had watched the 9-year-old being handcuffed over a lemonade stand. News vans lined Pine Grove Street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. The once quiet neighborhood had become the epicenter of a national conversation about power, justice, and change. Inside the police station, Chief Thomas paced his office, watching his career crumble through his window blinds. Each news report brought a fresh wave of criticism. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. Calls from the mayor, the town council, and reporters from every major network. The chief's face had already become synonymous with abuse of power on every major news channel. Back home, Emmy sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by supportive neighbors who had gathered to show their support. Mrs. Johnson brought her famous chocolate chip cookies, still warm from the oven. Mr. Wilson arrived with a brand new pitcher to replace the one that had been knocked over. The kitchen counter disappeared under casseroles and desserts as the community rallied around their young neighbor. "I can't believe how brave you were," one of the neighborhood kids said, sitting cross-legged on the floor near Amy. Other children nodded in agreement. They had watched everything unfold, and now they saw their friend differently, not as a victim, but as someone who stood up to unfairness. Emmy's father sat in the living room, fielding calls from civil rights organizations and fellow attorneys. Each conversation ended the same way: "This stops here. This case will make sure it stops here." His laptop screen showed dozens of emails from other parents sharing similar stories of their children facing discrimination. Each message strengthened his resolve. The town council called an emergency meeting for that evening. The normally half-empty council chamber was packed, with people spilling out into the hallway. Residents who had never attended a meeting in their lives stood up to speak, their voices shaking with emotion as they demanded action. "My granddaughter sells Girl Scout cookies on that same street," an elderly woman testified, her voice clear and strong. "Will she be next?" Others shared their own stories of encountering the chief's prejudiced behavior, stories that had gone unheard until now. Outside the chamber, a peaceful gathering formed. People held signs reading "Justice for Emmy" and "Lemonade stands are not crimes." Children set up lemonade stands along the sidewalk, their parents standing proudly beside them. It was more than just about one incident now, it had become a movement for change. Local business owners stepped forward, offering to help. The hardware store owner announced he would provide free supplies to any child wanting to set up a lemonade stand. The local printer made official junior business owner certificates, giving them out to young entrepreneurs. Social media continued to explode with support. #LemonadeForJustice started trending nationwide. Videos surfaced of other incidents involving Chief Thomas, each one adding to the growing evidence of his pattern of discriminatory behavior. His past actions, once ignored or dismissed, were now under intense scrutiny. Emmy's mom found her daughter that evening sitting on their front porch, looking at the remnants of her lemonade stand. "You know what, Mom?" Emmy said, her voice thoughtful. "I think I want to be a lawyer like Dad when I grow up. Someone needs to make sure this doesn't happen to other kids." As the sun set on that extraordinary day, the neighborhood had changed. People who had lived as neighbors for years now stood together as a community. They had witnessed injustice, but they had also seen the power of standing up against it. The lemonade that had spilled on Pine Grove Street was washing away something much bigger, the complacency that had allowed such behavior to go unchecked for far too long. A week after the lemonade stand incident, the town hall's meeting room was packed for the civil rights lawsuit hearing. Emmy's father stood at the podium, his voice steady as he presented evidence that would change their community forever. Behind him sat dozens of citizens, each holding yellow ribbons, a symbol of their support for Emmy and reform. "Today, we're not just discussing a lemonade stand," he began, laying out photographs and documents on the table. "We're addressing a pattern of behavior that has poisoned our community for far too long." The evidence was overwhelming. Testimonies from other families, statistics showing disproportionate enforcement of minor violations, and video footage from various incidents over the years. Chief Thomas sat at the defense table, his uniform pressed, but his confidence visibly shaken. His lawyer kept whispering in his ear, but the chief's eyes remained fixed on the growing stack of evidence against him. Each new piece of testimony seemed to age him by years. Mrs. Johnson took the stand, her voice trembling but determined. "I've lived here for 40 years, she testified. "I've seen children selling lemonade every summer, but I've never seen any of them arrested, until Emmy." Other witnesses followed, each adding another piece to the puzzle of systematic discrimination that had gone unchallenged for too long. The town council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats as video after video played on the large screen. Not just Emmy's arrest, but other incidents that had been swept under the rug. The room gasped as security footage from the police station showed how roughly Emmy had been treated even after the handcuffs were removed. Outside, the community had organized a peaceful gathering. Children had set up dozens of lemonade stands along the street, each one permitted and licensed by a special city council emergency measure. The proceeds would go to a new community fund for police reform and youth programs. The sweet smell of lemonade mixed with the sense of change in the air. Back inside, Amy's father presented the final piece of evidence, a statistical analysis showing how the chief had systematically targeted certain neighborhoods and individuals. The numbers told a story that couldn't be denied or explained away. The council members' faces grew increasingly grave as they realized the full scope of what had been happening in their town. "We're not asking for revenge," Amy's father concluded, his voice filled with purpose. "We're asking for change. Real, lasting change that ensures no child in our town ever faces discrimination again, whether they're selling lemonade or just walking down the street." The council's deliberation was shorter than anyone expected. The evidence was too clear, the public outrage too strong, and the need for change too urgent. When the chairman read out their decision, the room erupted in applause. Not just because of the substantial damages awarded to Amy's family, which they immediately announced would go toward community programs, but because of the sweeping reforms that would follow. Chief Thomas was placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation, but more importantly, the council approved the creation of a civilian oversight committee, mandatory sensitivity training for all officers, and a complete review of all police procedures and policies. As people filed out of the meeting, there was a sense that they had witnessed more than just a legal proceeding. They had seen their community stand up and say enough. The lemonade stands outside had run dry, but they had served their purpose, showing that the smallest actions could lead to the biggest changes. Emmy sat with her parents on the town hall steps, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of hope. A young reporter approached, notebook in hand. "What do you want to say to other kids who might face similar situations?" she asked. Emmy thought for a moment, then smiled. "Stand up for what's right," she said, "even if you're scared. And always make sure your lemonade is fresh." 1 year after the lemonade stand incident, Pine Grove Street looked different. A row of cheerful mini businesses lined the sidewalk every Saturday, children selling everything from lemonade to homemade crafts. Each stand proudly displayed a special Young Entrepreneur license issued by the new Community Development Program. Emmy's original lemonade stand spot now featured a small bronze plaque, "Where a Stand for Justice Began." She still set up there occasionally, but now she spent more time helping other kids start their own businesses. Her recipe book had grown thick with variations, strawberry lemonade, honey mint coolers, and her latest creation, Justice Juice. The police department had transformed too. The new chief, a woman who had grown up in the community, made it her mission to rebuild trust. Officers regularly stopped by the weekend market, not to check permits, but to buy refreshments and chat with young business owners. Some even hosted workshops teaching kids about safety and community service. "Remember when we were afraid to set up stands?" A young boy asked while arranging his cookie display. "Now look at us." Indeed, the street had become a model for youth entrepreneurship, featured in national news as an example of how communities could turn a negative incident into positive change. The Civilian Oversight Committee, born from the lawsuit, had become a model for other towns. Amy's father often received calls from attorneys across the country, asking how they had achieved such effective reform. "It started with a little girl's courage," he would tell them, "and a community that refused to look away." Mrs. Johnson had turned her front yard into a mini business park where kids could set up shops when the sidewalks got too crowded. Her famous cookies now shared space with children's art, handmade jewelry, and yes, plenty of lemonade stands. "This is what community looks like," she would say, watching the young entrepreneurs count their earnings. The former Chief Thomas had moved away, but his legacy remained as a lesson in how not to use power. The police academy now included a mandatory course on community relations, using the lemonade stand incident as a case study in what happens when authority is abused and how communities can come together to create positive change. Emmy's story made its way into textbooks and training materials. Law students studied the case not just for its legal implications, but for how it sparked nationwide discussions about community policing. Youth organizations used it to teach children about their rights and the importance of standing up for what's right. The community fund, started with the lawsuit settlement, had grown beyond expectations. It provided scholarships for young entrepreneurs, funded youth leadership programs, and supported community policing initiatives. Every grant application form included the question, how will this project help build bridges in our community? On warm summer days, the sound of children's laughter mixed with the clink of ice in lemonade glasses filled the air. Parents watched proudly as their kids learned about business, responsibility, and most importantly, fairness. The weekend market had become more than just a place to sell. It was where the community came together, where differences dissolved over cold drinks and warm conversations. Emmy, now 10, sat at her newsstand, teaching a younger girl how to make proper change. The money's nice, she explained, showing her how to count bills, but it's really about bringing people together. She had grown wiser beyond her years, understanding that sometimes the sweetest victories come from the sorest situations. As the sun set on another successful market day, families gathered for the weekly community picnic, another tradition born from the incident. Children ran between blankets spread on the grass, sharing their earnings and stories. The new police chief sat with residents, listening to their concerns and ideas, proving that authority could be paired with compassion. "You know what's funny?" Emmy told her parents as they packed up her stand. "That day could have made me afraid to try things. Instead, it showed me that one person, no matter how small, can help change the world." She carefully wrapped her grandmother's picture, the same one from that fateful day, now a symbol of how justice, like lemonade, is best when shared with everyone.